Hi, I'm Shifra Burke. Welcome to Shrink Rap. My co-host Edna Lazat couldn't be here today, so I'm doing this very unusual show where I'm going to ask questions or answer questions that have been posed many times about adult attention deficit disorder. As a coach who works with lots of business people, lots of entrepreneurs, and lots of people who have ADD or ADD-like tendencies, which is exactly the people I love to work with, there's a lot to say and a lot I'd like to share. So, without further ado, we'll start with some of the questions. So, what is ADD? The actual definition, attention deficit disorder, I think actually doesn't speak to the issue very well at all. And even ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, same issue. I don't think there is actually a deficit of attention. There's variable attention. There's difficulty sustaining attention in situations in which the person's bored, but there isn't a deficit of attention. In fact, lots of times people with ADD or ADHD have what those of us in the trade call hyperfocus. They can really focus a lot, which ends up being confusing for the spouse or the parents or the person themselves, thinking, well, I must not have it because I can focus really well. The disorder part I also struggle with because I don't think of it as a disorder. I think of ADD as kind of a cluster of traits, and those traits tend to revolve around three different areas. Areas including impulsivity, acting before thinking. Sometimes in a jokey sort of way we talk about fire, ready, aim. Distractibility or inattention, where people's attention is pulled in lots of different directions, and the H, hyperactivity or a kind of restlessness, where you might feel like you have a motor running, could be that kind of restlessness, or it could be a lot of squirming and shifting and changing positions and things like tapping. I guess you can't see that on the screen yet. Tapping a pencil could look very different. And in fact, that brings me to another thought, which is in some ways we should really be talking about ADDs, not ADD, because people are very different in the ways that their ADD might present. So for example, you could have someone who didn't have any hyperactivity at all, and they might not be noticed. Oftentimes they're female, but many boys and men have ADD without the hyperactivity. And that might be somebody who's really daydreamy or who's distracted, but not in, again, a fidgety or agitated or restless sort of way. That person might read a lot, think a lot, might look quiet or shy, and they may indeed be quiet and shy, or they may really just have ADD. For ADHD, the person could have lots of distractibility and lots of inattention, focus going a lot of different places, but have very little hyperactivity and very little impulsivity. So imagine like a recipe where you have a lot of flour, few eggs, and a little sugar versus lots of, change up that recipe. You're going to have very different kinds of outcomes, right? The food will be very different. Well, the people are very different too. So just because somebody has ADD doesn't necessarily mean we know what that means for that particular person. And we need to do some investigating to find out. And many of us have some of those qualities, whether we have ADD or not. We may have, if ADD were to start here, we may have a little bit of some of those qualities, and maybe we even bump up against having almost ADD. You could have, that would be mild ADD here, moderate, and severe. And again, You could have mild impulsivity, moderate impulsivity, severe impulsivity, mild on those same other kinds of things, the inattention or the hyperactivity. So again, understand that this is a very individualized kind of situation, so you want to be sure that when you're thinking about this for yourself, that you get a good assessment if you decide that it's important to do that. So, kind of answered the what is ADD and what is ADHD. And when you see it written, you often will see it interchangeable. And sometimes you even will see an AD/HD. They're all the same. Kind of like Kleenex or Scotties or tissues, I guess. All right, let's see. There are some things I'd like to say about upsides, because people think about the downsides of ADD a lot, but in my experience, there are huge numbers of upsides, which is why I like to work so much with people with this kind of constellation, even if they don't define themselves as having ADD. Many of the entrepreneurs that I like to work with, we never talk about ADD, even though very likely many of them have it, but it's not important to talk about it or to treat it even if it's not getting in your way significantly. And if the term or having a diagnosis gets in your way, then don't even worry about that if you take care of some attempt to resolve or compensate for some of the behaviors that might be problematic. But moving to the upside, the gifts, I like to think of the gifts of ADD. Lots of people with ADD are super creative, very bright, very out of the box in the way they think about things. They tend to have an imagination and can forecast certain kinds of trends and sometimes see the big picture. So people who are inventors, people who are artists, many wonderful, amazing writers, we're pretty sure Einstein, Da Vinci, lots of very important characters in life had ADD. And without them, our world might be a little bit flatter, so to speak. They might have even been the ones who dared to say that the world was round. I don't actually know who first posed all of those kinds of theories, but very often people with ADD, and especially with a little bit of the impulsivity, will say ahead of time what people might be thinking but don't dare to say. And I think that puts us in good stead in the world, in that things happen, things get created, things are born, ideas are exposed and tried that might not be otherwise by those of us who might be more conservative in both our biology and our ways of being. What other upsides might there be? Oftentimes really interesting sense of humor, and again, oftentimes a kind of brilliance that we might not see ordinarily. So very often people with ADD are inspiring and they bring others along with them. So don't be surprised if one of the Pied Pipers in your life might have a little or an extra dose of some of those qualities in that cluster. The downsides. Well, organization often is really difficult for many people with ADD. So you see messy desks and people who can't find their keys or can't remember where they put their wallet, or they go through their purse or their briefcase searching for things. They spend lots of extra time looking for things that are misplaced. That could be the attorney who's looking for files, or the accountant who's not put things where they belong. You know, just and you could recognize this in yourself if you frequently are finding yourself spending extra time and feeling like you're wasting a lot of time looking for what the average person might know, the location of. So some of those times we think that's because of something called executive function, which is around planning and prioritizing. It's a biological thing that some people are better at and some people not so much. And sometimes it's around attention, that distractibility piece that I talked about earlier. If you're not, in a certain way, synced up, well, let's say your mind and your activity is not synced up really well, then you might be doing something without thinking about what you're doing. So many of you might know the experience you have where you're driving down the road and suddenly you realize you've lost X number of miles. You can't quite believe you're where you are. And you went into some sort of, whatever we might call, kind of hypnotic kind of place and lost that time. Some people who have ADD lose a lot of that time. And so putting their phone down, they actually don't remember that their phone is in their hand when they put it somewhere. So it's not easy then to remember where your phone is. If you have a place for everything and you learn some strategies for paying better attention and for learning how to be more, whatever we might call, present in the moments of your life, the better chance you have of knowing where your things are. So that's one of the significant downsides for people. They really need help with figuring out filing systems and all sorts of organizational things. Other downsides, sometimes the impulsivity is difficult for the person, him or herself, and the people around, and that might be the employer or the employee or spouse or children, because people who are impulsive sometimes blurt things out, interrupt other people. They don't listen in a way that feels and seems respectful. Sometimes they don't listen well at all during chunks of conversation. And in fact, there is a cartoon that we can put up right now that illustrates what we're talking about. And in this case, we have a woman who is clearly not listening very well. And then for equal opportunity, we have another cartoon in which, in this case, the male is not listening very well. This is actually the source of a lot of distress for partners and, again, people who are involved in the lives of those with this particular part of the ADD, spectrum, the cluster of traits. So that's, as a coach, I and other coaches who work with people with ADD really are able to help people figure out strategies for learning to pay better attention, listen more, focus more, and life can be a whole lot better when that happens. Because the person, him or herself, with ADD doesn't like the fact that people around are unhappy with them and that they've lost lots of the important parts of conversation that they wish that they'd been able to hear. Other downsides might be around completing tasks, organizing time. Those can be really problematic. Time is a real issue for many people with ADD, being late and really losing chunks of time because you start off going to, let's say, do task A. You're let me think of a profession. You could be, I'll pick attorney again because I work with a fair number of attorneys. So you could be an attorney, and what you're going to do is try to organize some billing. And then as you're thinking about the billing, you realize that you need to check an email because you're not sure if you spent 10 minutes or a half hour on that particular problem. So you go to check your email, and then while you're in your email, you realize, oh my God, I forgot all about responding to John. I need to respond to John. And you can see how this goes, right? And pretty soon, you've forgotten completely about the fact that you needed to do your billing. And so things get done just little bits at a time, but checking off the box and completing is not really easy. And the whole finishing is not easy. And part of that is because things get boring, and part of it is distractibility, and then a whole host of other things. But again, there are strategies people can learn which would make a huge difference. Forgetful, related to this. Sometimes people literally forget things like paying bills, forget to hand in assignments, forget to pick up kids at school, forget an important talk that they have to give, forget the appointments, so dentist appointments, et cetera, et cetera. And again, there are strategies people can use to help them learn, get reminders, and so on. At work, this can be super problematic if you're late for meetings. You know, you might be the owner of a business and you're late for your own meetings. You might be an employee who gets reprimanded. You might be a CEO who walks into your meetings 10 minutes late, and unbeknownst to you, people are pretty disgruntled even though they act respectful because you're the boss. So it comes back to haunt people in a whole lot of ways. Many of the people I work with are in their own businesses, what some people might call solopreneurs. So they might be therapists, attorneys, accountants, financial planners. And being late for meetings is really not cool with clients, but it happens a fair chunk until people get a handle on it and again learn ways to work around that natural inclination to lose time. Let's see, I'm moving past my cartoons to remind myself my own cues here. Some people want to know, if I have ADD, do I need to take medication? And the answer is medication is actually the last thing to look at, not the first. Now, unfortunately, the way things work in our culture is that we tend to be medication oriented, and I think part of that is the way insurance works. Many people have insurance that will pay for a meeting with a physician or a psychiatrist, and it seems like the shortest distance between 2 points, but even when medication is warranted, in my view, over the long haul, it's a real mistake for children or adults to do medication only and not do something else that really will position them and leverage them to understand what changes need to be made. Medication makes a difference in terms of focus, for sure. But if you don't know what you want to be focused on, then it's still not easy. If you've got a habit of being late, if you've got a habit of inattention and not listening, et cetera, it really is helpful to look first at some other ways to be responding. So for anyone who's worried about finding out if you have ADD because you think automatically you're going to be on medication, that's actually a worry that you might not need to have. So first, I would say it's really important to get a good assessment and have someone diagnose with you that yes, indeed, you have ADD. And your ADD might be mild, it might be moderate, it might be very severe. And what kind of ADD is it? Is it ADHD? Is it the kind that's inattention, or is it the kind that's mostly impulsive? And any of that information is really important. Along with that, the person would need to help you get educated about ADD, some of which we're doing right now on this show, like the different kinds of ADD, and some other kinds of ADD, like what else can you be doing for yourself. In addition, the person that you'd be working with, the coach or the psychiatrist or whomever you are going to be talking with, ideally is going to start to talk to you about structure. You know, what kind of filing system do you have? What sort of, phone reminders are you using? What plan do you have to set priorities for the day? Are you using lists or checklists to help yourself? Those kinds of things for someone with ADD can be really quite simple and straightforward and make a huge difference. For some of my clients, just figuring out that they could have a to-do list on their phone as listed as tasks for today, that they punch in, and that they don't have to try against all odds to remember and think to themselves, well, I should remember this, there's no problem, I should remember this, and then they don't. And the consequence is a missed appointment or an unpaid bill or a phone call that didn't get made or a kid that didn't get picked up or an assignment that didn't get completed. There are lots of really pretty straightforward, simple, easy to implement kinds of things. So structure is going to be really important. Some kind of coaching or counseling, now that might be if the biggest problems are at work, then working with a coach who understands business or understands work will be really important. If the problems primarily are at home in your relationship with your spouse or your partner, then doing some couples coaching or couples therapy really makes sense. And there's a difference between coaching and therapy, and you can talk to a coach about that or a therapist about that. Basically, the difference is that the coach is not going to spend a whole lot of time figuring out with you how you got to be the way you are, or really in depth how you feel about having ADD or how you feel about the problems that are coming up, as much as what are the strategies for moving ahead. Very practical, very straightforward. Other therapies or other modalities, again, all of this centered around things besides medication. Somebody might do biofeedback. There's something called LENS, which is a kind of biofeedback. You can do traditional biofeedback, both very helpful for people with ADD or ADHD. There's something called CogMed, which is a computer-based program for helping working memory, because for some people with ADD, their working memory, their ability to sustain attention is impaired. It's compromised. And so there's, again, things that are non-medical that you can do that can make a big difference. So if you decide to do medication, I would still really urge you to look at adding in one of these other kinds of, compensations and things to learn, because it's a 1 + 1 = 6 or 8 oftentimes. And if you decide to get medication, please see someone who is really, really, really specializing in ADD. Many people are seeing their family doctors, and I think in some ways that's better than not doing anything if in fact you have ADD. But the difference between someone who's studying the medications all day long, that's all they do, or primarily what they do, because most physicians, most psychiatrists, even who specialize in ADD, aren't doing it 100% of the time. But if 50% of their day is spent on that, they really know how to tailor the medications to you, and they know which medications will fit for what else is going on for you. If you're a person with ADD, you might have some anxiety, or you might have some depression, or you might have some kind of obsessional sorts of things, or you might have a learning disability on top of your ADD, because often ADD and something else can go hand in hand. And so talking with someone who specializes makes a very big difference. In my experience, the difference is so dramatic that it's really worth finding out who might be around, who would be helpful to you. And if people want to contact me, either by email, it's my first name, Shifra, which you can see on the screen right now, actually, at shifraburke.com, or better yet, burkeconsulting.com, then that would be great. Or feel free to leave a message for me. At the end of this, there'll be my phone number, and it's 978-446-9600, and I can give you some leads on who might be helpful for you. But again, feel free to email, and in the subject line maybe put Shrink Rap or ADD or something like that, so it's less likely to go to spam. I'd like to review with you an online option for you to look at. So if we could pull up the checklist at this point, I'm going to read these to you because I'm not sure how easy it will be on the screen. So I'm going to read a couple of them to you because I had no idea that I was really we're almost out of time. But maybe the main thing to tell you, if I don't get very far, is that this is called the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale. And you can Google this, and you can get one that's like on the screen. This is a short version. It has 6 items. Or you can get the longer version, which has 16. And so things like, how often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? And this goes from never to very often. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organization? How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? And the last one on this list, how often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things like you were driven by a motor? Now, if most of your answers were in the never or rarely, chances are that you're very unlikely to have ADD. If you got several of these, 4 or more, in the sometimes, often, or very often, you might want to look at the possibility that you might have ADD. And whether or not you do, for some of those items that I mentioned, there's assistance and strategies you can get by reading or talking with someone, even if you decide never to deal with the fact that you might or might not have ADD. So I literally have 1 minute left here, and I would like for Vilu to put up the last cartoon, which I will read to you, which says, "I can talk the talk and walk the walk, just not when it's inconvenient." And the reason that that's important is because for most of us, we really don't like to do things that are uncomfortable for us or out of our comfort zone. But for people with ADD, it's especially difficult. Boredom, standing in line, it's just excruciating sometimes. And so you don't have to live with that kind of excruciating. You really can end up being able to make a difference and make your life a whole lot better for yourself, for your family, for your children, for employment and career. And I hope that you decide to do something.